What if I told you that the youngest king in history didn't ascend to the throne, but was born on it? Alfonso XIII of Spain was a ruler from his very first breath, yet amidst the grandeur and power lay a life filled with challenges and betrayals. Betrayals perpetrated by the king against the people of Spain, all for the sake of his own power. Stay with us today and you'll discover why he fled into exile and how he fought to regain the throne until his last breath. Alfonso XIII of Spain was born on May 17, 1886. His father, Alfonso XII, had died the previous November, meaning that Alfonso was Spain's new king from the moment he was born. The young king was born in the royal palace in Madrid, and the newborn baby was carried naked on a silver platter to the prime minister. A few days later, Alfonso took part in a court procession for his baptism, with water from the River Jordan in Palestine having been brought in for the ceremony. In 1889, the French newspaper Le Figaro described Alfonso as the happiest and best loved of all the rulers of the earth. It was the last time that anyone would share such a sentiment, as Alfonso's happiness was about to rapidly decline, followed later by a decline in his popularity. 5 months after that article was written, Alfonso became severely ill during the 1889 to 1890 pandemic, also known as the Asiatic flu. He wasn't even 4 years old, yet he had already stared death in the face. Spain as a nation was also experiencing a great deal of turmoil during this time. Shortly after Alfonso's birth, while his mother Maria Cristina of Austria was acting as queen regent, the Spanish-American War broke out. In just a few short months, Spain lost control of all of its colonies in the Americas and the Philippines to the United States. Their only colonies that remained were in Africa. Growing up, Alfonso received a primarily military education. He had a collection of military tutors who stressed the importance of Spanish nationalism. He was also taught about politics by Vicente Santamaria de Paredes, a member of the Liberal Conservative Party that had been created by order of Alfonso's father, and he learned about morality from Jose Fernandez Montaña, a priest and integrist who believed the Catholic faith and its teachings should be fully integrated into public law. On Alfonso's 16th birthday, his official coming of age, he took over his full duties as king. There was a full week of celebrations throughout all of Spain leading up to May the 17th, when Alfonso took his oath to the Constitution before the Cortes Generales, the Spanish legislature. His first few years as king would be relatively uneventful before things started spiraling downward. By 1905, at the age of 19, Alfonso was ready to find a wife. Of course, he also already had his first illegitimate child at that point, but that didn't matter. Whilst visiting King Edward VII at Buckingham Palace, Alfonso met Victoria Eugenie of Battenberg, granddaughter of Queen Victoria. The two hit it off romantically, but there were numerous problems with this potential union. To start, Victoria was a Protestant. In order to marry Alfonso, she would have to convert to Catholicism. Victoria was willing to change religions so that they could be together, but there were also concerns that her blood was tainted. Not tainted by a bloodline of inferior lineage, but tainted by the potentially deadly disease haemophilia. While haemophilia can affect women in rare cases, because it's a recessive trait carried on the X chromosome, it usually only affects men, with women acting as carriers of the disease. Victoria's brother, Leopold, suffered from haemophilia, so there was a 50% chance that she was a carrier of the disease as well. There was no means by which she could be tested for the disease at the time, and Alfonso was willing to gamble on the coin toss that she was not a carrier. And that just left the matter of Alfonso's mother. Maria wanted her son to marry a member of her family, the House of Habsburg-Lorraine, or at least some other Catholic princess. As far as she was concerned, the Battenbergs were not an important enough dynasty to be deserving of her son's marriage. Fortunately for the couple, it didn't take long for Maria's protestations to relent. In January of 1906, Maria wrote to England to officially propose the union of her son and Princess Victoria. That March, they all travelled to France for Victoria's conversion to Catholicism, and on May the 31st, just after Alfonso's 20th birthday, the wedding finally took place. The royal wedding took place at the royal monastery of San Geronimo in Madrid, and it should have been a great day of celebration. But the anarchist Mato Moral had other ideas. When the wedding procession was marching from the monastery to the palace, Moral threw a bomb out of a window and into the street in an attempted assassination of the monarchy. He missed his intended target, but the bomb still killed 30 people and wounded another 100. A year later, Alfonso and Victoria's first son was born, but shortly after his birth, the fears regarding Victoria were confirmed. The newborn Alfonso XIV was a haemophiliac. The couple conceived 6 more children over the next 7 years, with the middle child being stillborn. Of the 5 others to survive, only their last child, Gonzalo, also inherited the gene for haemophilia. Alfonso would outlive both of his haemophiliac sons, who died under nearly identical circumstances in the 1930s. Both were involved in car accidents where they seemed to walk away with only minor wounds, but in both instances their haemophilia caused them to die of internal bleeding caused by the accidents. Even though Alfonso had known the risk when he expressed his intent to marry Victoria, he still blamed her for introducing the disease to his royal family. After Gonzalo was discovered to be the second offspring with haemophilia, Alfonso largely distanced himself from his wife. Instead, he engaged in a number of extramarital affairs, resulting in the siring of 4 more illegitimate children. These numerous affairs, in part, helped Alfonso earn the nickname of the Playboy King. But it wasn't just the affairs that contributed to that nickname. Alfonso also loved pornography, so much so that he became Spain's first producer of pornographic cinema and one of the first in all of Europe. It's even suggested that Alfonso was not just the financier of these films, but also took an active role in the writing and casting of them. And these were not tame films that were only considered pornographic because of the era in which they were produced. Although they were silent, black and white movies, they featured full depictions of hardcore sex and taboo themes such as Sapphism and Catholic priests engaged in sexual acts. During his reign, Alfonso commissioned as many as 70 movies, though only 3 survive today. He also used an intermediary between himself and the production company Royal Films, keeping their existence as secret as possible. Alfonso feared that if word of his debaucherous hobbies got out, it would make him unpopular with the Spanish citizenry. Little did he realize it would be all of the official decisions that he made as king that would make him unpopular throughout the nation. So across Europe, the Allied powers were waging war against the Central Powers of World War I. Alfonso found himself caught in the middle of this, both personally and geographically. His wife had been an English princess, and his mother was born an Austrian princess. Popular opinion on the war remained split throughout Spain, so Alfonso decided that Spain would remain officially neutral during the conflict. Rather than take sides, they would provide aid to POWs on both sides of the war. This decision served him well politically and even got him nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, though it carried with it an unintended consequence. Alfonso had already fallen ill as a child during the Asiatic flu pandemic, and he would again become gravely ill during the 1918 pandemic. The pandemic had been ravaging the world, the large-scale global conflict only increasing the ease with which it spread from one continent to another. However, people weren't particularly well informed about the severity or ubiquity of the disease. The news media in countries that engaged in the war was being heavily censored and restricted to prevent the release of information that could prove useful to enemy nations. These restrictions limited the spread of information about the pandemic as troops were being heavily affected by the deadly flu. But with Spain remaining neutral, their media wasn't subject to wartime censorship, causing Alfonso's infection to make national news. As a result, the disease that likely originated in the United States became known as the Spanish flu in honor of Alfonso and the Spanish population, who were believed by the rest of the world to be feeling the pandemic more severely. Following the conclusion of World War II, Alfonso decided it was time to go to war in Africa. Spain was in danger of losing control of its colony in northern Morocco, and with all but the nation's African colonies having fallen, Alfonso was not prepared to give up on Spain as a colonial power in Africa. While this decision was popular among the Africanists, those that wanted to expand Spain's colonial reach in Africa, the Africanists were outnumbered by the abandonistas, those that wanted to abandon Morocco altogether. To the abandonistas, Morocco simply wasn't worth the money and lives they would have to sacrifice to maintain control. Undeterred, Alfonso mobilized his forces to begin the Riff War, a 6-year war to maintain control over northern Morocco. While Spain would eventually emerge from the war victorious, this was one of the worst decisions Alfonso made as king. Early on in the conflict, Spain's General Manuel Fernández Silvestre had been advancing into northeastern Morocco. This charge forward was met with difficulties, as Silvestre was trying to claim too much territory too quickly. They had not properly set up forts or means of resupplying water and other necessary provisions, nor had the people in the territories they were advancing through been completely subjugated before continuing forward. But Silvestre was known for his aggressive nature, making him one of Alfonso's favorite generals. Although the military was already stretched thin and lacking in provisions, Alfonso sent a telegram to Silvestre urging him to move forward. Even the aggressive and impulsive Silvestre had been planning on slowing down to regroup and resupply, but if the king wanted him to move forward, then he would have to do so. Spain's forwardmost camp was the small village of Anal, fortified with 5,000 Spanish troops. There had been some small skirmishes leading up to it, but on July 22, 1921, the real Battle of Annual began. A force of 3,000 Riff fighters opened fire upon Annual with their artillery. Silvestre tried to order an organized retreat, but when the Moroccan volunteer soldiers abandoned the military and fled for themselves, the military was left exposed and disorganized. It was a rout resulting in Silvestre's death. His body was never recovered. Reinforcements were quickly sent to the battlefront, but it was all in vain. In a little over 2 weeks, Spain had lost all the territory that they had gained since 1909. The Riff tribes and their force of 3,000 men under the leadership of Abd el-Krim had suffered 800 casualties. Including the waves of reinforcement that came, Spain sent between 20 and 30,000 soldiers into battle, and officially 13,192 of them were killed. The speculation that the total lost may have been as high as 20,000, but 13,000 is the number that was reported to the Cortes Generales. Few people would have expected King Alfonso to have been on the front lines during the fighting, but where exactly was he while this was happening? Well, he was on vacation in France, playing a round of golf. According to the reports, when Alfonso was alerted to the disastrous outcome of Annual, he shrugged his shoulders and replied, "Chicken meat is cheap," and continued his round of golf. He chose to remain in France rather than cutting his vacation short to console the families of those lost in battle. Alfonso was already unpopular with the Abandonistas, who were only increasing in numbers, but this callous decision began turning the Africanists against him as well. Things only got worse the following year when an investigation by the Cortes Generales uncovered that Alfonso had personally urged Sylvester to continue his march forward into Morocco. By 1923, most Spaniards were beginning to see the Riff War as a pointless endeavor. In August, soldiers aboard ships from Morocco began to mutiny, while others simply refused to board the ships at all. The investigation into the annual disaster had already damaged the reputation of Alfonso, as well as suggesting there was rampant corruption throughout the military, and Captain General Miguel Primo de Rivera decided that enough was enough. Primo de Rivera had previously sided with the Abandonistas, but he enlisted the aid of 4 Africanist generals to help him stage a military coup and overthrow parliament. All 5 generals were loyal to King Alfonso, despite having just initiated a military dictatorship, so Alfonso named Primo de Rivera as prime minister to give him a sense of legitimacy. Although many Spaniards were understandably upset about their parliament being thrown aside, many supported the new dictatorship. The country was rife with economic problems, not to mention the ongoing disaster in Morocco, and they felt that a strong military leader could get Spain back on track. Primo de Rivera's impassioned speeches around the country showed the populace that he truly was a Spanish nationalist at heart, so they decided to give the dictatorship a chance. While Spain did finally emerge victorious in Morocco in 1926, the economy failed to improve. Things were getting worse under the new government, and Primo de Rivera had become increasingly unpopular over the years. A plot was hatched by General Manuel Godet to forcibly remove the dictator from power. Although Alfonso was almost certainly aware of this plan, he chose to do nothing to stop it. Primo de Rivera and his associates may have all been loyal to the monarchy, but their overwhelming unpopularity was no longer doing Alfonso any favors. Primo de Rivera was exiled to Paris, where he died a few weeks later from a combination of the flu and diabetes. With the position now vacant, Alfonso appointed General Damaso Berenguer as Spain's new prime minister. The goal was for this to be a return to normalcy and to the constitutional monarchy that Spain had had before the military coup. Berenguer's reign as prime minister was known as the dicta blanda, or soft dictatorship. He was still largely acting with unilateral authority, mostly to undo some of the harsher policies enacted by his predecessor. Alfonso believed this was the right thing to do for his country, and he was probably right. However, he was being overly optimistic. His hope was to use Berenguer's tenure as prime minister to restore Spain to the nation it once was. But this plan relied on all of Spain pretending that the previous 7 years hadn't happened. Life for a monarch was much different than for a commoner, and the people couldn't just forget the dictatorship they'd been living under for years while Alfonso was free to sleep around and produce porn. Likewise, they couldn't forget how closely the dictatorship was associated with, and had been loyal to, Alfonso. After only a year in office, Berenguer resigned his position as prime minister. Alfonso named Admiral Juan Bautista Aznar as the new prime minister in February of 1931, but the position would not last long either. In April, it was time for Spain's local elections throughout every municipality in the country. There were 80,000 elected positions up for grabs, and the results of the election were very clear. The Republican coalition of leftists, socialists, and communists had a convincing victory in the elections. They had fallen just short of a nationwide majority, but they had a clear plurality and won with sweeping majorities across major cities. In 80% of major cities across all of Spain, the Republicans had landslide victories, claiming as many as 75% of the available seats. It was a very clear mandate from the voting public. The monarchy was dead. The Second Spanish Republic was declared, and Alfonso fled to Paris in exile. After the national elections of the new Spanish Republic, the Constituent Republican Cortes held a debate regarding Alfonso and what was to be done with him. Although the former monarch had fled to Spain of his own accord, the newly elected government still felt that he needed to be held accountable for his actions. He had used promotions and rewards as leverage to utilize the military for his own gain, was responsible for the deaths of thousands of Spanish soldiers in the Battle of Anual, and then he used his loyalist generals to overthrow parliament to prevent further investigations or scrutiny into his culpability for the events in Africa. There was a lot of debate over precisely what crimes would best fit, but it was a concise and eloquent speech from Prime Minister Manuel Azaña that put an end to the debate. The Prime Minister pleaded with the Cortes to vote unanimously in holding the former king accountable, and the vote was passed declaring that Alfonso was guilty of high treason. But that wasn't the end for Alfonso. At least he certainly hoped it wouldn't be. Although the monarchists had only won 25% of the seats in the 1931 elections, there was still a devoted faction of anti-republicans plotting to rebel against the current government. Alfonso became deeply involved in these anti-republican plots while in exile, and he had never abdicated the throne. If the monarchy could be restored, he believed he would still be king. In 1936, there was an attempted coup of the Republican government. Alfonso tried to align himself with the rebel faction, but their leader, Francisco Franco, made it clear that he would not restore Alfonso to the throne. While the rebellion failed at overthrowing the government also failed to fully quash the rebellion. What resulted was the 3-year Spanish Civil War that saw the nationalists emerge victorious. The Second Spanish Republic had ended, but Francisco Franco remained true to his word. Rather than reinstating Alfonso as the King of Spain, he named himself as Caudillo, acting as the nation's dictator for 36 years, until his death. In 1941, Alfonso finally renounced his claim to the non-existent Spanish throne, declaring his son Juan the new and rightful king. He died just a month later of a heart attack, and Francisco Franco ordered 3 days of national mourning in Spain. Alfonso had been born a king, but he died in exile and in disgrace without ever having learned how to rule.